Olá, hello everyone. My name is Mariana Pestana, and I've joined Technico 2 weeks ago, I think it is today, as an invited assistant professor. I am an architect and a curator, so you're all probably wondering, what is an architect doing here? And I didn't bring that meme with, the dog at the ISS, but so I have a PhD in thank you, in architecture and fiction from UCL, from the Bartlett School of Architecture. And what I do is speculative architecture. So I make spaces to rehearse possible futures. That is fictional scenarios of what tomorrow may look like. And these are scenarios where you can enter and take part and hopefully inform. So the kinds of architectures that I make, they are highly collaborative. They involve many, many people, both in their making, but also in their running. And I do this because I think it's really important to open up spaces where people can engage with ideas about the future. So that the future isn't something very opaque and difficult and broad that is presented to them and often is one inevitable thing or line of action, but actually is something open that is developing in the now, in the present, and where people can take part. The kind of the center that we are creating today deals with a huge technological change that, as we've seen over the presentations this morning, is going to have social, environmental, cultural impacts and change. And so that's why I think it's important to think about how that change meets people, audiences, and the public. So you will all recognize this image. It's already 20 years ago, which is kind of terrible. I just realized. But this is, of course, Minority Report's Spielberg film. And this device here, this design, architecture, this technology is what David Kirby, who's a professor at the Center of History of Science, Technology and Media at Manchester University, calls a diegetic prototype. So cinema has this incredible capacity to attract public support for technological developments by revealing possible futures on the screen, stimulating desire in audiences. This is extremely important because an object that is fictional can be perceived by audiences as real and then gain public support. And that public support is important for the implementation of the idea in the actual world, in the reality, but it's also important for justifying funding opportunities and new developments and more technological devices. So what cinema does is it naturalizes these technologies at the eyes of the public. And so the film works as a pre-product placement, as Kirby says, for companies to gain public support and raise funding for their projects. But the public here is just a passive receiver of the technology. The public just views and justifies the development by accepting it. It has no real say in how the technology develops. And so as an architect, I create spaces where social, technological, but also cultural futures meet the public. And I'm interested in making spaces where audiences are not passive observers, but actually participative agents of change. So collaborative frameworks where many voices are represented that allow for plural viewpoints and where people can participate and live for a moment the futures that are being presented to them. And I do this with an aim towards critical citizenship, the idea that if we are able to understand the ideas and prototypes of today that are shaping the world of tomorrow, we may better position ourselves critically in the present and understand what's at stake. So my studio, I run a studio together with 3 other people called The Decorators, and we make temporary architectures that are conceived as and presented as working systems in which many, many people can take part. They happen outside of the walls of museums and cultural centers, out in the streets. And what we do is we go out and talk to communities through using kind of real world systems like a radio, in this case, but sometimes a restaurant, a cinema, etc. And together we discuss possible futures, then we rehearse them, like we build them in 3 dimensions. And eventually these projects start merging with reality, right? So because they take a built form, they're not like a book where you read about a certain idea, but it's still like distanced. Here we can really, we make it real for a limited moment in time or in a specific place, but it's there, unavoidable. And so I think that that advances the plausibility of certain ideas. One of our first projects was Ridley's, a temporary restaurant, which we built on site in a market in East London. It doesn't look beautiful, but that doesn't matter, because what we were testing there was a food for food exchange system. So visitors to the restaurant would become part of a cycle. They would buy £3 worth of any of the ingredients that we needed for the next meal, come back, exchange that for a cooked meal. A lineup of local chefs cooked, everyone on a different day, daily menus using the market food, while diners sat at a communal table high above the market. And so for us, this temporary installation was an opportunity to imagine an alternative socioeconomic program for the public realm. We designed a system, did this temporary building, a set of rules, a financial system, a collaborative network, and a public program. And what we were concerned with was imagining alternative uses for public spaces and alternative ways of refurbishing a street. And we implemented that vision in a 25 square meter site. So very small, and only during 3 weeks, very short. And so what we built was a fragment of this world we were idealizing, and then people got to experiment it. From local councils, I went on to work with cultural institutions such as museums, festivals, biennials. I did this at the Lisbon Architecture Triennial in 2013, where I commissioned an architect and an artist to design an embassy. And then we invited different organizations to become ambassadors on a weekly rota. The guest ambassadors were not official envoys, from high-ranking diplomats, these kinds of people. Instead, they were representatives of radical civic movements and marginalized communities, envoys of places, and people who usually remain in the shadow of democratic representation and national representations. And so we chose these let's say, unrepresented ambassadors, opening up space to imagine alternatives to the dominant politics and power structures here in Lisbon, in this case. I did this also in Davos at the World Economic Forum, where I worked with 2 set designers to make a series of scenarios about possible futures based on emerging technologies. One of them was, this fragment of a bridge. This was at the time the largest architectural project that was ever crowdfunded. And so we asked the question, what if public infrastructure was funded by the crowd? And this generated like a huge discussion on Twitter and other platforms, of course, because it kind of questions the very idea of citizenship and responsibility, or the responsibility. I worked also at Victoria and Albert, the world's lead museum of art and design, and I worked there as a curator. And I did this there by gathering over 100 objects that witness, in a way, emerging societal, technological, political changes, from Cambridge Analytica's emotional graphics to Facebook's then drone Aquila. So I wanted to transform the museum into a civic space for discussing these emerging futures and bringing them outside of the research labs, outside of the universities and private companies to a cultural space of discussion. And more recently, I've done this in the context of a design biennial that I curated, where I commissioned 10 permanent installations urban interventions in the city, amongst them this floating island, which is really beautiful, that rehearse architectures of solidarity between humans and the more than humans, so natural world, other species, etc. So in this, the world we are living in the unequal, unbalanced world we are living in, I think the capacity to imagine alternatives is not equally distributed among all, and partly because imagination is influenced by past experiences, limited by social, by economic conditions. And so I want to argue that distributing imaginative power to underrepresented groups of society and engaging them as collaborators, as future makers, I believe that these curatorial strategies that I try to kind of convey enable spaces from where to conceive of alternatives to the way that we imagine the future. So my view of imagination has a very clear political orientation, because I believe that imagination, anticipation, aspiration are cultural capacities that we can foment and which really enable people to navigate towards a better life for themselves. So as we are launching this center dedicated to decentralization through technology, I'm really, really excited to explore how these kind of speculative architectures and these kind of participatory, curatorial strategies can help us open up new questions. And I'll leave you with some. Oops, sorry, I should have left this one. So how can blockchain technology support participatory cultural processes? I mean, that's a very straightforward question. But as the very idea of citizenship broadens, you know, in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of species even, can distributed technologies contribute towards truly inclusive forms of participation? Then I'd like to ask, as we imagine decentralized institutions that are financed, owned, governed by their own members, it's crucial to think how these decentralized online communities interact with the public. I mean, these are digital architectures, but to what extent do they, you know, what are the contact points with the exterior world? Do physical, temporary architectures allow us to experiment with living fragments of these blockchain-driven futures? You know, as we imagine new forms of organization, can we make them more real through architecture? Do we advance their plausibility if we make them real, if we make them tangible and physical? Yeah, and finally, will our cities be shaped by the logics of distributed agency in the future? I think this is really exciting. And what could that possibly look like? So that's it. Thank you very much. I don't know if you have questions. Any questions? Oh, yeah.
I can ask one. I will ask.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the So I was just wondering, while we were describing your work, like it has a lot of connections with what we're already doing in HDI. Like when we were talking about having people actively experiencing prototypes or installations, that's something that we aim for in HDI. It's usually called experience prototype, but you're just taking it to another level. But in our case, we see it as a step in the process. Like we learn with that, and then we refine whatever we're trying to do. I was just wondering if in your case, that's also something you do. Like at the end, you have installation, you have people there. You take that knowledge that you gain from that installation to another project or to the next step, or what happens there?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I work with city councils, and we worked with city councils for many, many years, that's what we did. So we would, at the end of a project, we would do a report with our findings, and that report was then going to inform the urban or development sort of strategy for that area. When in the context of cultural institutions, for example, this is not a common practice, right? So the end is that discussion, actually. And I find that this is actually problematic because by the way you react or you sort of respond to a change or a societal or even technological change, it's almost like it's already a little bit too late. And that's why I'm really excited to be working now from an environment like this, where we are in the early kind of stages of the development of these ideas.
Yeah, you can do that.
I have a very related question, which is, if you think that this is fostering the imagination of any local community you are working with, how can you empower them as a next step to take it as their own, and then to enable the build of that apart or on top or in complementary with any structure you might be working with, municipality or not, but how the community takes it as itself.
Yes, no, exactly. I think, well, there's a big part of it which is building trust with the community, right? So I find often that in order to build trust, it's interesting to create sort of mini institutions. So that's why, for example, we ran a radio program for a long time, so we could justify the engagement that we were doing. So by setting up a framework, you're not just like someone like parachuted into, say, a community, or you actually have a reason to be there. But I find that you also have to find modes of exchange, right? Like for the knowledge that you gain by working with the community and finding ways of either remunerating or then finding incentives so that the community can have an active part in the project afterwards. I'm not entirely sure this answers your question, but
Points direction.
okay. Thank you.
One more comment, question. I think that what you were saying is the scale of the experiments. When you take that, for instance, to the level of a neighborhood, is I think we know how to test these things, and at the level of a few 6, 7, 10, 12 people, but to test and understand the consequences of technologies that could reach out to thousands and millions of people, it's where the thing becomes very complicated, and that's where technology plays a role. It would be interesting to see how we could scale all of this, combining the more hard technological approach with HCI designs.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.